Why do fools fall in love? Why do birds sing so gay? Love is awake the break of day. Why do they fall in love? Oh, time for lunch. Maybe not. Anyways, it's World History with Mr. Lamond. 9.4, how did the Romantics show love to the era? So if you look on the last page, you also see how was Romanticism a reaction to revolution. Romantics, not a group, not a Cupid sitting on a cloud, not a series of movies that you take your girlfriend to, but it's an artistic time period. And what is Romanticism, you say? Glad you asked that question. Let's take a closer look. It's an artistic time period. It's art, literature, music in the 19th century, basically around the French Revolution. And it's a reaction partly to all of the science and enlightenment with its emphasis on reason and rational thought. We must do things with our brains. We must do things through data. We must only do what we observe. And, you know, the emo kids are over there going, well, I've got some feelings about this. And that's Romanticism is. You can see it's characterized in this little chart by 5 eyes. Your imagination, your intuition, your idealism, your inspiration, and your individuality, none of which are very scientific subjects. So you have this desire to express yourself differently. And that's where Romanticism comes into play. It's this reaction to all of that science and data. Instead, it's an emphasis on emotions and feelings. So let's take a closer look at some examples. First off, real quickly, pause and take a moment to draw 3 symbols for DOK 9.4 that might represent this new artistic movement, where it's an emphasis on emotions and feelings, not brain and science and data. So go ahead and pause, go work on that, come back when you're done. 3 areas that we want to look at in terms of what Romanticism might look like. One will be literature, one will be music, and one will be the arts. In literature, there's a variety of styles that are romantic in nature. You have the distant land and eras. Nostalgia. Nostalgia is when you're looking backwards at things, feeling like, you know, the old days, they were just such a good time. You know, people think, oh, the 1950s, what a good time. Nostalgia for the 1950s. And yeah, but we still had polio. That wasn't necessarily a good thing. And we hadn't had the civil rights movement. It's not so good. And so you have many examples of nostalgia. Well, one of them are the books of Victor Hugo, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or Les Miserables. Victor Hugo was a Frenchman who talked about all of these very powerful time periods in French history. You know, here's this poor Quasimodo, the hunchback, who has more heart and more feelings than the Catholic Church. But it's very dark and emotional. It deals with death and suicide. Then you have Les Miserables, this poor little waif who's befriended and taken care of by this man who's been sentenced to prison. Great, powerful stories. The unexpected hero is a prisoner. That would never happen in your more rational, realistic books. Another example are the supernaturals, the mysteries. This was with the Brothers Grimm and their fairy tales. I'm not sure if you've ever read any of the Brothers Grimm's original fairy tales. Do a quick Google search on the original Grimm's fairy tales and find out about how in Cinderella, in order to try and get the glass slipper to fit their feet, her 2 stepsisters actually chopped off their toes. It became a bloody mess. But there's lots of examples of these cute, idyllic, sometimes Disney-esque fairy tales that are so much more darker in their original Romanticism time period. Of course, maybe the greatest of all in terms of your supernatural mystery is Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. And being so young and dipped in folly, I fell in love with melancholy. Melancholy is kind of a sad heartbreak. Edgar Allan Poe is known as being one of the first kind of dark detective series. I mean, think about his poem about the telltale heart, a murder, a mystery. His poem, The Raven, with its dark bird, its dark protagonist. Lots of overly emotional stories. And last but not least, our noble savage and nature versus science, the modern world. Great example is a novel by James Fenimore Cooper called The Last of the Mohicans. And in this story, the American Mohican, a Native American who most of Europe would have seen as a savage, he's the good guy. These Native Americans referred to maybe as a noble savage. That, in Europe, the greatest of all thing would be the nobility. But yet, in this book, the nobility are kind of the bad guys. And Cooper is flipping these things on their head with these emotional, powerful tales where they're turning the way that we see people in the Americas, these Native Americans. And another great example is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Remember, Frankenstein is the doctor, and this is Frankenstein's monster, who is this cruel, heartless being created by science. Too much science can be a bad thing. We could also talk about Romanticism, the music. Now, I have a couple pictures here that represent the Beatles, groups from the 50s and 60s. And if you notice, there's a before picture and an after picture. Same place, but notice the clothes, the beards, the hair. Notice the way the Beatles look here, very conformity-minded, ties. Can you imagine, the most powerful rock or rap group in America walking around in coats and ties with nice shiny shoes? They look like they're on the way to a business meeting. And here's the Beatles a little later. Now, what happens? Well, they went through the 60s. They went through protests, the hippie movement. In other words, music can be affected by the times. So when we talk about people like Mozart and Haydn, those classical composers, it was very symmetrical, balanced music. You could listen to some Mozart compared to some Beethoven. You might remember we did this right before we left on our little excursion. But just pull up some Mozart. Notice how symmetrical it is, how simple, how it kind of keeps the same rhythm. Whereas when you get to Beethoven, whoa, this guy's off the chain. He wrote a symphony called Eroica. But Eroica was originally supposed to be for Napoleon. Beethoven idolized Napoleon as this bringer of democracy and freedom. And, oh, whoops, he's a psycho dictator emperor. Let me change the name of this symphony. Of course, Beethoven's very famous for his Fifth Symphony, the Ode to Joy, which we have actually floating through outer space right now. But Napoleon is probably the best example. Think about Napoleon. He was almost deaf when he wrote the Ninth Symphony. Almost deaf. Napoleon has, look into his background, a tremendous amount of pain and suffering. His father used to beat him because he didn't make good enough music. His wife abandoned him. He tried to raise a son that he was estranged from. Incredible pain. We also have the two composers, Chopin and Liszt, piano concertos that they wrote for their new nations of Poland and Hungary. A little bit of nationalism with their music. But nobody was more nationalistic than Tchaikovsky. He's the guy who wrote the 1812 Overture as kind of a pep rally to kick in Napoleon's butt, right? His nationalistic symphonies. He also did Swan Lake and the Nutcracker. William Tell, the William Tell Overture to celebrate Swiss independence. All great, powerful, romantic composers. This depth of pain equals the depth of emotion. And then Wagner, a German opera, The Ride of the Valkyries. Dun, 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 dun. Right at the time when Germany is being super nationalistic, they want stories to show how powerful they were back in the day. Remember King Arthur and his round table that the English kind of made up to make him look cool? Well, that's kind of Wagner and his Valkyries. P.S. Hitler loves these guys. You can also see Romanticism in the arts. This is probably the most famous Romantic painter, Delacroix. Look at the emotion, the power in these paintings. Look, this young child. He's exploding into the French Revolution. I know she ain't wearing any clothes and kind of stuff's hanging out. But the point is, Lady Liberty is leading them. And she's leading them to justice. She's not worried about, a wardrobe fail. She's worried about making sure that the tricolor, the three colors of liberty, equality, fraternity of France, can live on in the revolution. Delacroix, this powerful, emotional painter. He was called the Great Romantic. Here's another Delacroix, the Raft of the Medusa. Look at this pain as this group of people is suffering, trying to reach out in a last-ditch effort to be rescued by a boat that's way off in the distance that they can barely see. Notice all of the power in this painting. Constable was an Englishman known for his landscapes. Another kind of emotion is the idyllic of nature. We're getting ready to talk about the Industrial Revolution. And in it, you're going to see the opposite of this. You're going to see factories and pollution, the negatives of change. And here Constable is looking back at the idyllic scenes of nature. Notice they're kind of fuzzy. It's not meant to be like a camera picture. These pictures are more like a feeling, an emotion, the beauty and power of nature, but yet as you might feel them, not necessarily just see them. Turner, very similar type paintings. Notice we see some light shining in the darkness. Notice the explosion of the sunrise. This wraps up our Romanticism, a reaction to revolution. Take some time to write your romantic lyric and to show your meetings of the romantics, showing some of these people as they come together, all helping you to finish up Unit 9.